In the spring of 334 BC, a young king stood on the shores of the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. He was just 20 years old. With him was an army of about 40,000 men from across Greece, and they were about to embark on what would become one of the greatest military campaigns in history. Their target was the superpower of the age, the vast and wealthy Persian Empire. This was the empire that had threatened Greece a century and a half before, burning temples and subjugating cities. Now the tables were turning. Over the next 10 astonishing years, this young king would lead his men through countless battles, across deserts and mountains, to the very edge of the known world. He would carve out one of the largest empires ever seen, a realm that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus River. To the Persians, he was Alexander the Accursed, a destroyer of their ancient civilization. But to the West, he was immortalized as something else entirely. He was Alexander the Great. How did a single man in such a short time achieve so much? Let's go back to the beginning to understand the world that forged him. To understand Alexander, we must first understand the world he came from. Around 500 BC, the rugged land of Greece was a scene of remarkable and unprecedented development. This was the golden age of classical Greece, a time of extraordinary innovation in art, philosophy, and the art of warfare. The Greek world was not a single, unified nation, but a collection of fiercely independent city-states. The two most powerful were Athens and Sparta, and they could not have been more different. Athens was a naval superpower and the birthplace of democracy. It was a vibrant cultural hub where art, drama, and philosophy flourished. Thinkers like Socrates and playwrights like Sophocles were laying the foundations of Western thought. On the other hand, we have Sparta, an austere and militaristic society. From a young age, Spartan men were trained for war, and their formidable army was feared throughout the Greek world. In 480 BC, the Greek city-states faced an existential threat. The mighty Persian Empire, under King Xerxes, launched a massive invasion of Greece. It was the classic story of a massive superpower versus a collection of smaller, independent states. In a desperate bid to stop the Persian advance, a small Greek force, famously led by 300 Spartans under King Leonidas, made a heroic stand at the narrow pass of Thermopylae. They held off the enormous Persian army for 3 days, inflicting heavy casualties before they were finally encircled and killed to the last man. Though a tactical defeat, the stand at Thermopylae became a legend of courage and sacrifice. But the Persians continued their advance, and while the Greek fleet defeated them at the naval battle of Salamis, they couldn't prevent the Persians from reaching Athens and burning the sacred temples on the Acropolis. The following year, at the Battle of Plataea, the Greeks finally won a decisive land victory, forcing the Persians to abandon their invasion. The next 50 years were a golden age of peace and prosperity for Greece. But this peace was short-lived. Rising tension between Athens and Sparta and their respective allies eventually led to the devastating Peloponnesian War. This conflict tore the Greek world apart and dragged on for decades, leaving the city-states exhausted and fractured. Wars between the city-states continued for almost a century, leaving them weak and vulnerable to a new rising power in the North, Macedonia. For centuries, the sophisticated Greeks of the south had viewed the mountainous kingdom of Macedonia as a backwater, barely Greek at all. But under the dynamic King Philip II, Macedonia emerged as a formidable military force. Philip's most famous reform was the introduction of the sarissa, an 18-foot pike that was twice the length of a normal Greek spear. This long pike was wielded by trained infantry fighting in a dense, close formation known as the phalanx. From the front, a phalanx presented a solid wall of iron spear tips, making it virtually unstoppable. In 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip's new army crushed the joint forces of Thebes and Athens. This victory made him the undisputed master of Greece. Through a combination of alliance and conquest, Philip formed the Hellenic League, also known as the League of Corinth, with himself as the hegemon or supreme commander. Only Sparta stood aside, with Greece united. Philip began to plan his greatest ambition, a pan-Hellenic or all Greek war against the Persian Empire. Their old foe was now a weakened superpower, its immense riches ripe for the taking. But on the eve of launching his grand campaign, Philip was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards, a victim of Macedonia's brutal court rivalries. He was succeeded by his 20-year-old son Alexander. Alexander was a man of immense talent and ambition. He was brilliant, restless, and blessed with boundless energy. As a boy, he had been tutored by the great philosopher Aristotle, who instilled in him a love of Greek culture and learning. But he was also a fierce warrior, having already proven himself as an experienced military commander under his father. He inherited his father's grand plan to invade Persia, but first he had to secure his own position as king. He moved with ruthless efficiency. At home, he had potential rivals executed to quash any threats to his rule. Then he crushed rebellions in Illyria, Thessaly, and central Greece. To deter future uprisings, he made a special example of the city of Thebes. He completely destroyed the ancient city, razing it to the ground, and sold its terrified people into slavery. The message was clear: oppose Alexander, and you will be annihilated. By the spring of 334 BC, with his position secure, Alexander was ready to launch his father's war. He led his army across the Hellespont into Asia Minor, planting his spear in the soil of Asia. It was the start of his incredible journey. Let's take a closer look at the formidable machine he led. Alexander's army was a highly sophisticated and professional fighting force drawn from all parts of Greece. The infantry was commanded by the veteran Macedonian general Parmenion, a man who had served Alexander's father. In the front rank were the 9,000 Macedonian phalangites, armed with their sarissas. These were professional soldiers, extremely well trained and drilled. In battle, they formed up in a phalanx that was typically 16 ranks deep. This packed formation was virtually unstoppable from the front. However, it was also difficult to maneuver and highly vulnerable to attacks on its flanks or rear. To guard against this, 3,000 elite infantry, called the hypaspists or shield bearers, guarded its flanks. They were armed with shorter spears and were more mobile than the phalangites. Behind the Macedonian phalanx was the second line, made up of 7,000 Greek allied hoplites and 5,000 Greek mercenaries. They took their name from the hoplon, their large round shield, and carried shorter 8-foot spears. Their phalanx was not as effective as the Macedonian version, but they were still heavily armored and well armed for the time. Supporting the heavy infantry were the skirmishers. The Agrianes were the army's elite skirmishers, expert javelin throwers from what is now southern Bulgaria. They were lightning fast and could harass the enemy before the main battle was even joined. But the true shock troops of Alexander's army were the companion cavalry. This was a force of 800 elite horsemen armed with spear and sword. They were the hammer to the phalanx's anvil. Alexander himself led the royal squadron, the elite of the elite, into the heart of the battle. There were also cavalry from Thessaly, Greece, and other allied states, providing a total of about 5,000 horsemen. Alexander's army was a balanced and lethal combination of heavy infantry, light skirmishers, and shock cavalry, all commanded by a young man who knew exactly how to use them. The Persian Empire was a vast, sprawling realm divided into provinces called satrapies, each ruled by a governor or satrap. The satraps of Asia Minor met to decide how to face Alexander's invasion. Memnon of Rhodes, a skilled Greek general in Persian service, urged caution. He advised using a scorched earth strategy, burning villages and crops as they retreated, so Alexander's army would quickly starve. It was brilliant advice, but the satraps were unwilling to lay waste to their own provinces without a fight. They decided to make a stand at the river Granicus. The Persian army formed up behind the river, which, although shallow, had steep banks. Their front line was a wall of about 10,000 cavalry from across the empire, from Iran to Afghanistan. Behind them, in reserve, were several thousand Greek mercenaries. The Persians may have been unsure if they could trust these men in combat against their fellow Greeks, so they placed them at the rear. Determined to attack, Alexander deployed his army. He placed Parmenion in command of the left wing, with the Thessalian and Greek cavalry. In the center were the massed spears of the phalanx. Alexander himself took command of the right wing with the companion cavalry and his elite infantry. Ignoring advice to wait until dawn to cross, Alexander ordered an immediate assault. The crossing was brutal. As they reached the middle of the river, the Greeks came under a hail of javelins and arrows from the Persian line. Those that made it to the far bank were immediately charged by the Persian cavalry. Alexander was in the thick of the fighting, a desperate melee of men and horses. His attack seemed reckless, but it was buying time for the rest of his army to cross. Then his own life was suddenly in peril. He was charged by two Persian nobles. One struck him on the head with his sword, cracking his helmet. Alexander struck him down with his lance. Then a second noble raised his sword against the king, but he was struck down by one of Alexander's officers, Cletus the Black, who saved the king's life. Now the full Greek army was across the river, and the Persian cavalry faced the impenetrable wall of the Macedonian phalanx. Most turned and fled. The speed and shock of Alexander's attack meant Persia's Greek mercenaries hadn't even had time to join the battle. Alexander, in a blood rage and regarding them as traitors, ignored their appeals for mercy. The mercenaries were surrounded on all sides and massacred. Alexander had won his first great victory. Asia Minor now lay at his mercy. 17 months later, Alexander faced the Persian king Darius Itu himself. Darius emerged behind Alexander's army, blocking his escape route. Darius was determined to trap and destroy Alexander, whom he outnumbered almost 2-1. He chose the coastal plain near Issus, a narrow battlefield just 6 miles wide from mountains to sea. While it forced Alexander to fight, it also prevented Darius from exploiting his massive numerical advantage. Darius placed his best cavalry on his right towards the sea, where the ground was better for horses. His best infantry, his Greek mercenary hoplites, formed the center. Alexander deployed his army in a similar fashion to the Granicus Parmenion on the left, the phalanx in the center, and Alexander on the right. He saw the strength of the Persian cavalry facing Parmenion and moved his Thessalian cavalry to reinforce him. Alexander, at the head of his army's right wing, charged. Once again, the speed and shock of the Macedonian advance sent the enemy reeling back. But in the center, the Macedonian phalanx was in trouble. In its effort to keep up with Alexander, its formation had become disordered. Now, in fierce fighting with Darius's Greek mercenaries, the phalanx was slowly being driven back. Alexander, seeing the danger, regrouped and led the companions in a headlong charge straight at the Persian center. The Greek mercenaries were soon in disarray. Alexander fought his way towards Darius himself. Rather than face this apparently mad and fearless Macedonian king, Darius fled the battlefield in his royal chariot. As the news spread, his troops abandoned the fight and tried to save themselves. The battle turned into a massacre. Alexander had won another stunning victory. With the Persian field army in retreat, Alexander turned to subduing the western territories. The coastal cities of Phoenicia submitted, but the island city of Tyre resisted for 7 months. Alexander built a causeway to the island, protected by giant siege towers. Tyre's defenders fought desperately, even using fire ships to counter-attack. But eventually the city fell, and its people were killed or enslaved. Gaza too was taken by siege. Alexander then marched to Egypt, where the Persian governor surrendered the entire province, along with the royal treasury. At Memphis, the priests welcomed Alexander as their liberator and crowned him pharaoh. At the mouth of the Nile, he founded a great new city that would bear his name, Alexandria. From there, he traveled to the desert oracle of Siwa, where the priests welcomed him as the son of Amun, the king of the gods. This divine lineage was a powerful propaganda tool. He wasn't just a mortal king, he was a god. The oracles and acclamations had now convinced him that his destiny was to rule the entire world. He received a letter from Darius, offering a fortune in gold, his daughter in marriage, and half his empire in exchange for peace. Alexander rejected it. He didn't want half the empire, he was coming to take it all. In 331 BC, Alexander advanced into the Persian heartlands, seeking a final showdown with Darius. The Persian king had assembled a massive army at Gaugamela, near modern Mosul in Iraq. Darius had chosen open ground to make better use of his advantage in numbers. His soldiers had also flattened the terrain to make it suitable for his fearsome scythe chariots. The Battle of Gaugamela was the largest and most decisive battle of Alexander's campaign. Alexander deployed his men in their usual formation, with the phalanx in the center and Alexander on the right. The battle began with Alexander leading his wing out to the right. This move took the Persians by surprise. They mirrored his movement, shifting troops from their center to prevent Alexander from outflanking them. But this was exactly what Alexander wanted. It was a trap. By enticing the Persians to weaken their center, he had created the opening he needed. Darius unleashed his scythed chariots, but the expert Agrians took out the horses and crews, while the Greek infantry opened lanes for the chariots to pass harmlessly through. Now, Alexander struck. He led the companion cavalry and parts of the phalanx in a headlong charge straight at the weakened Persian center, fighting his way directly towards Darius. The sudden ferocity of the assault threw the Persians into panic. The center broke and ran, with King Darius himself leading the rout. But Alexander's left wing was in serious trouble. Parmenion was virtually surrounded by a huge onslaught of Persian cavalry. He sent a desperate appeal for help. Alexander, who had been pursuing Darius, abandoned the chase and regrouped to aid his left flank. It was the hardest and bloodiest fighting of the battle. Finally, as news of Darius's flight spread, the last Persian horsemen turned and fled. Gaugamela was a stunning and complete victory. The road to Babylon was open. Alexander entered the great city in triumph, recognized as its new rightful ruler, so too at Susa, where he took his seat upon the royal throne of Persia. In early 330 BC, he reached Persepolis, the ceremonial capital. Initially wanting to appear as a legitimate successor to Darius, he eventually ordered the city to be pillaged and burned as retribution for the Persian invasion of Greece and the burning of Athens' temples 150 years before. Alexander now headed north in pursuit of the fugitive Darius. As he closed in, the Persian king was murdered by one of his own governors, Briseis, who proclaimed himself the new ruler. Alexander caught up with Briseis and had him executed as a king slayer. He had now conquered the vast Persian empire, but his journey was far from over. Alexander's goal now was to subjugate the empire's eastern provinces, lands that had never fully accepted Persian rule, and to reach the far edge of the world. This took him into the harsh, mountainous terrain of modern-day Afghanistan and Central Asia. Here, he faced a difficult guerrilla war against the Bactrian and Sogdian tribes. The brutal fighting and long separation from home began to cause dissent among his Macedonian troops. They were unhappy with his adoption of Persian customs, viewing them as effeminate and decadent. To make matters worse, during a drunken argument, Alexander killed Cletus the Black, one of his best generals and the man who had saved his life at the Granicus. He was full of remorse, but his growing arrogance was alienating his old comrades. When he tried to introduce the Persian ritual of proskynesis, or prostrating himself before the king, he crossed a line. To the Greeks, this was blasphemy. Only a god was worthy of such respect. He was forced to back down. More conspiracies were uncovered, and more old friends were executed. In 327 BC, Alexander married Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian lord. It was a political move to help quell the local revolt, but it also allowed him to continue his advance into modern Pakistan and India. In 326 BC, Alexander fought his most costly battle against the Indian king Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes. Porus's war elephants inflicted terrible casualties on the Greeks. Despite the victory, Alexander's army was exhausted. He wanted to push on into India to reach the great river that Greek geographers said formed the edge of the world. But at the river Hyphasis, his army mutinied. After 8 years and countless battles, they had had enough. They refused to go any further. Alexander was furious, but he had to turn back. The return journey was a disaster. He followed the rivers to the sea, fighting more battles, and being nearly killed by a wound to the chest. The march through the Gidrozian desert in southern Pakistan was a nightmare. Extreme heat and shortages of food and water led to terrible suffering and many deaths. When he finally returned to Persia, Alexander's mood was dark. He executed several of his governors for corruption. At Susa, he arranged a magnificent mass marriage of Macedonian officers to Persian noblemen, and he himself married two Persian princesses, seeking to fuse his empires. But his Macedonian troops mutinied again, offended by his apparent preference for Persian advisors. He had the ringleaders executed, but his speech reminding them of their glories together eventually led to an emotional reconciliation. At Ecbatana, Alexander's closest and most trusted friend, Hephaestion, died of fever. The king was grief-stricken and went days without eating. Then, as he planned a new campaign to Arabia, he developed a sudden fever and died days later. He was just 32 years old. The cause of his death has never been established. It may have been malaria, typhoid, or even poison. Alexander died undefeated in battle. In a decade-long campaign, he had created one of the largest empires the world had ever known. But it was vast and unstable, held together only by his own brilliance and name. He left no plans for his succession. His generals, the Diadochi, or successors, immediately began fighting among themselves to carve out their own empires. Alexander's own wife Roxana and his young son were murdered in the bloody wars that followed. His golden sarcophagus was hijacked on its way back to Macedonia and eventually ended up in Alexandria, Egypt. Today, its location remains one of the world's great unsolved mysteries. Few men have ever had such an impact on the course of history as Alexander the Great. The breathtaking achievements of his short life ushered in the Hellenistic age. Greek ideas, art, language, and culture spread across the territory of his former empire, fusing with local traditions to trigger new developments in science, government, and culture. Some of his successor kingdoms were short-lived, others endured for centuries, but all would eventually fall to new forces, and in the West, to the rising power of Rome. But the name of Alexander the Great lived on as a legend, an inspiration for conquerors and leaders for millennia to come. He was a man who dared to dream of conquering the world, and for one brilliant, shining moment he succeeded.